The Fabula Shyuzet narrative structure has been adopted by filmmakers for decades, providing a unique display that film, as a medium, isn't bound by storytelling rules, and in fact can enhance a story being told by breaking them. The genesis of applying this narrative structure to cinema can be traced back to a man named Viktor Shklovskić, who was one of the major figures associated with the Russian formalism movement, being the first, and I quote, theoretician to take a semiotic approach to the cinema. Shklovskić fled from Russia in the early 1920s to Berlin, where he endeavoured his studies into the then new medium of film, to test whether the theories he had developed about prose could successfully be applied to cinema. Let's identify the distinction between Fabula and Shyuzet. According to Hven, the Fabula is the story's state of affairs and events as inferred by the viewer, organised into a chronological and casual order, and the Shyuzet is the actual arrangement of the visible and audible events in the narrative. In layman's terms, Fabula is the story itself, and Shyuzet is the way in which that story is being told through means of sequencing. One of the first examples of this structure being successfully harnessed was Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles. Released in 1941, the film starts with Kane on his deathbed, uttering his last words. The film then takes us through flashbacks and multiple perspective narrations of Kane's life, being one of the first of its time to use a nonlinear structure that created a suspenseful allure around Kane's character, making audiences question not how the story would end, but rather why Kane's life happened the way that it did. According to Joshua Seemann, when experimenting with nonlinear structure in his own work, he said, "The nonlinear format created smooth transitions between places in time. In addition, the structure allowed me to show only the most important flashbacks without having to waste time describing the events surrounding them. This made the story as a whole much less boring and allowed the audience to become more invested in the narrative." This is a testament to the advantages of separating Fabula and Shyuzet in film, to create more of an immersive viewing experience for the audience. The opening scene of Fight Club, directed by David Fincher, takes place in a key location of the final act of the story. Over the duration of the first scene, and the whole film in fact, this character uses narration to tell the audience's inner thoughts, and provides exposition within the scene about the situation he is in. We are thrust into a story that seems to have already taken place before we joined the characters. The question then arises, how and why are they here? We spend the rest of the runtime piecing together the story that eventuates to the final act, now with the context as to how our characters found themselves in that situation, which results in a satisfying payoff for the audience. By being introduced to our protagonist in what immediately seems like a dire and threatening situation, it hooks the viewer in and takes them along for the ride. This is the magic of what this narrative structure offers. It focuses on the how instead of the what. Goodfellas, directed by Martin Scorsese, has a similar approach as Fight Club, but the opening scene is not the end of the story, but rather a pivotal event for the characters. The film opens with a scene of three men driving at night when they hear a thumping sound coming from somewhere inside the car and pull over to investigate. It is revealed to us that they have a man in the trunk who is covered in blood. Within those 2 minutes, we start to ask questions. It's an extremely engaging opening scene, which wraps up with Henry Hill narrating.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
If Goodfellas opened at the beginning of the story, with Henry Hill's character as a kid, there wouldn't be that intrigue to hook us in to watch this character as he navigates his youth, and the addition of narration would feel like a cheap way of giving exposition. But because we have already seen Henry's desire to be a gangster come to fruition as an adult, the narration of his adolescence feels warranted and lends itself to the montage of his youth as a retelling of his beginnings for the audience's benefit. Narration is an important tool used in modern cinema that utilizes the fabulous Shyuzet narrative structure. Narration is the chance for hindsight reflection on the beginnings of characters' own stories, and often work in tandem with the visual elements of the film to still convey that same level of character building and storytelling that a conventional narrative structure would have. The fabulous Shyuzet narrative structure lends itself well to the genre of drama because of its almost surreal nature. In the real world, nobody begins telling a story from the middle. It would just simply confuse the recipient of the story. But in film, that confusion can be smoothed over and justified using visual and audible techniques, such as flashbacks and narration, and help add to the dramatic nature of the story. In the introduction of Shklovski's book, Literature and Cinematography, Richard Sheldon says this with his philosophies in mind. The standard film plot requires only skillful choice of scenes, chronological displacement, and interesting contracts, with the same characters all the way through to hold the scenes together. Chronological displacement has the same effect as in the novel. It creates suspense by delaying the denouement.